Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, back with part 2 of our Shinkenger breakdown and discussion. Last time, we talked about how this season's big moments and smaller details built up the characters into fairly complete people, for the most part. Having discussed most of our heroes, it's now time to discuss the man at the center of it all. Takeru's best early character moment was getting embarrassed by G. It only lasts a few seconds, but before that point, before that seemingly meaningless detail, an argument could be made that this dude is actually more heartless than Jaden ever was, and acted way pissier on top of that. But, as time went on, I realized that at the core of Samurai is a boringly acted, clumsily handled, unintentionally hilarious character that was written only to embrace the duty-bound facade of Takeru, but not really the actual person. Granted, this is an adaptation, so I'm not saying that Jaden is lesser only by way of difference. But as we touched on last time, you almost have to utilize that lens to a degree if you've seen both shows. And seeing as how they had to credit Shinkenger's original writer in Samurai 2, that only furthers the point. But here's what I like about Takeru. First and foremost, it really helps that in his case, the reasoning behind why he can't tell anyone who he really is better put together. He's not anyone's brother. He's not destined to save the world. He's nothing, a nobody, a shadow used exclusively to buy time for a young, up-and-coming princess. You might even say, as I've said countless times before, he shouldn't even be there. But here he is, acting as a decoy before the actual Shiba head appears much later on. Now, coming from my pre-Shinkenger viewing perspective, I knew that Kaoru would eventually appear because, well, Lauren exists. But even if I didn't know she was coming, even if I could experience this as the twist it was intended to be, everything about making said twist work relies on the character work getting there. So the question then becomes, did it work? It all starts with a humiliating childhood anecdote, but for Takeru, he keeps building on that, every now and then showing the rare flash of humanity inside a mostly focused show. I mean, this man called up Genta to order him chicken just to make amends with his Zord. And it's moments like these that really make Takeru a very solid character. I take issue with some of his standoffish ways, but once the home stretch of the season arrived, I never once had to question why his team would struggle with the idea of seeing him removed from power. We discussed how Mako came to trust him over time, but we also have Chiaki, who's motivated to become better than him someday. Yeah, it's your fairly typical shonen anime type of motivation, but it works as a good enough reason to see him more committed to the cause. And lest we forget, Takeru was literally freaking out at the sight of Kotoha potentially never waking up again. Yet another powerfully humanizing moment, and one of several connecting points between the two highlighted and carried forward into the team's struggle to follow Kaoru, so you know she's ride or die, as is Genta because childhood friend. Ryunosuke is uncomfortably submissive at times, but yeah, you don't really question his loyalty at least, and it does make him a far more interesting character to see his devotion driven by interpersonal connection and not duty for a change. Otherwise, he'd be the one telling everyone else to get in line and follow the rules. But this time, not so easy. Every single person here has connected to their leader, and sometimes to each other, in a notable way. So, when Kaoru does come, it was fairly easy to sympathize with Takeru's position. Again, he's got no real connection to the Shiba family or the samurai lifestyle it's carried the burden of for generations. When it comes right down to it, he was used, and as a kid no less, who had no real say in the matter. He was used as a means to an end and was tossed aside just as quickly. And on top of that, Kaoru is cold, kind of antisocial, not exactly the lovable sweetheart martyr that her counterpart became, which actually adds up because living in isolation. So now we're given a much more solid reason to buy into the team's reluctance to accept her, to accept any of this. Takeru's struggle to find himself is better handled too, because in this version, leaving never felt like his choice. This lifestyle is the only thing he's known, and now it's being forcibly ripped away from him. So yeah, from his perspective, fighting Juzo again does kind of seem like the only thing he can really do at the time until he can re-enlist as a Shinkenger. Takeru isn't quite on the same level as Mako, but who really can be this season, but for all of my relatively minor issues with him, I do feel like I always understood where he was coming from. And I can say that about most of his team as well, because that's where Shinkenger really focused itself. The action is fine. The mechs are hard to look at times, and the day-to-day plots can leave a lot to be desired, but they mostly got it right where it mattered most. However, the same can't be said for some of the villains. Dokoku is just kind of there. He does a little bit more than the drunk bastard that religiously takes his medicine, but beyond that, there's really not much to him. He's the threat, and that's that. But that didn't really surprise me too much, since even in Samurai, the only real players were Dayu, Decker, and of course, Serrator. So I came in expecting an enhanced look at them by way of the original versions of their characters, same as we had for the heroes themselves. And the results were disappointing. It wasn't bad, but here's the deal with these two. Juzo has a sword forged with the souls of his family and an insatiable appetite for bloodshed, apropos of just being disillusioned with the way of the sword. And that's fine, I guess. And Dayu is a psychotic yandere who literally killed her lover because her love was unrequited. Although, her insane past does give her a very welcome connecting point to Mako, who is never quite the same while fighting her, or even the same in general in a downplayed way once she learns the truth. The problem is, neither of these character backgrounds and subsequent motivations really quite work, and here's why. Juzo and Dayu are presented as half Gadoshu, half humans, potentially setting them up for the classic redemption arc that the story seemed to be going for, without the context of spoilers, of course, since neither are really all that bad compared to the big guy. But that's kind of the problem. The background details don't quite align with what we see from them in the present day. Ironic, given how the heroes of the story almost universally have details about their past, usually by way of the parents, that inform us of how they see the world and what we see from them. By way of flashbacks, we learn that Juzo and Dayu are just horrible human beings, the very antithesis of good, really, making them, in a way, more evil than many of their fully Gadoshu cohorts. But it doesn't stick, because when they interact with each other or other characters, you rarely see that side of them. You rarely see the mental instability that drove them to madness in the first place. You never see, for example, this sick, twisted would-be bride targeting every man who broke the heart of another woman, whether reasonable or not. And Juzo, despite being more invested in his inbuilt cause, has an entire section where he and Genta are just bros for a minute, bonding over sushi. You can make these two reprehensible asshats, or give them a redemption arc to strive for, but Shinkenger seemed content to overplay the backstories, making their troubled past considerably more dark and more sinister than any of their present actions would imply. And there's nothing we learn in between then and now that would support the idea of this massive change being at all viable. Like, Dayu is a psychopath. There's no reason to feel any empathy for the way she falls to darkness, so her getting used by Dokoku as a means to his ends is a fitting ending for her. Maybe even a deserved one. And Juzo killed a butt-ton of people just because he felt like it as a human. But, by all accounts, selling his soul to cheat death made him a much less homicidal person, which is really, really backwards. So seeing him as a much more well-rounded, sociable person than Rick Medina's take on the character feels like it's missing something. Or that they wanted to lighten the tone a little bit while giving these two a bit of depth, but then they forgot about all that when it came time to actually decide on their personal histories. And even Akumaru, who makes more sense as a character, is kind of just there, with no real connection to anything that's happening. It's here where Samurai made their most noteworthy changes in adaptation, and by doing so, they improved on the villains. Not all of the villains, since there's hardly a difference between Xandred and his counterpart, but these three, yes. The main thing about Serrator is that he actually has a connection to all of this. He put all of this in motion years ago, in service of his own agenda, so his focus on continuing to manipulate people who made an impossible choice feels like a better version of how Diabolico is set up with regards to the similarly positioned Mitchell family. For as much as I rail against Jaden's disappearing act in the back end of Samurai, the show does do well to embrace the pointlessness of that second fight, and really Decker's fighting in general. Decker already lost once, and has pretty much gone off the deep end by this point, and Jaden has nothing better to do. It's at this point, and really only this point, where Decker's need for battle and blood overtakes him completely, at which point he becomes unreachable and unsavable, essentially losing the half of him that was human for a death one could argue that he welcomes. But here's the real kicker. That means that the once human Dayu sacrificed everything to Serrator for what ultimately amounts to nothing. And because both characters are presented as well-meaning but desperate people first, everything about their fall becomes a lot more powerful and a lot more tragic, especially with Dayu, who not only gives up her humanity to save Decker, only to see him succumb to the demons inside, but doesn't get to be redeemed at all. She didn't get to be Rancic and rise above her past. She didn't get to be Astronema and choose good, and she certainly didn't get to fight alongside her former enemies, as Jared and Camille did. Instead, she ends up going from just another part of Serrator's plan to being simply part of Xandred, killed solely to make him seal-proof. Samurai is super flawed, we all know this, but man, trading your life for nothing, making a deal with the Nylock Devil for nothing? That's flat out the best change they made to this otherwise largely unchanged adaptation. For those reasons and more, I could never call Samurai a complete flop, despite the overly popular sentiment. The writers, but specifically James Bates, were fighting a very, very uphill battle against Jonathan Sakor to make things even slightly different. And when they did get to break out, it showed, usually for the better. Both of these shows have their high points, but Shinkenger just had a lot more of them, in large part due to that aforementioned uphill battle. And the sad part is, I could easily see this concept really working in the West, in spite of how entrenched it is in Japanese culture. We've talked before about how they could have used the American identities most of these Rangers sport as a way to clash and eventually coalesce with the Eastern sensibilities inherent to the story. Wendy Wu made it work, and that decom could almost count as an honorary Power Rangers movie. The original plans for adapting this season, talks of an international team amongst other really cool, really innovative sounding ideas, also could have worked if implemented. But the second a writer's room turns into a war room, anyone not named Hayao Miyazaki ain't making a great final product out of that, let alone a fully fleshed out product. And that's on top of how much they rushed production. And it shows. But getting back on topic here, I think Samurai Sentai Shinkenger is a really solid and at times great toku show, but it doesn't have too much to carry it beyond its core characters. Most of said characters are really good, even great, but while Shinkenger gets it so very right in the department that matters most to me, it doesn't get it all right all the time, but it does more than enough for me to say with confidence that it's the better version of Samurai. It doesn't have the same ironic, entertaining humor, but it has poise, it has focus, it has details and big moments spread all around, but more than anything, it has heart. That's really what I think separates the two, and that lack of heart is the most disappointing thing about Samurai. Now, important to reiterate though, is that I don't mind the Samurai Rangers, mostly. Mike feels like he's one bad day away from having more in common with Juzo than his own counterpart, but in spite of his presence, I enjoyed more of the season than I didn't. I really liked two of the characters in particular unironically, 3 if you cherry-pick Bulk's pre-Samurai accomplishments, and Jaden's absurdity is by far my channel's biggest and longest running joke. I mean, how many times have you guys even seen this exact smug? So points for that too, I guess. But all that having been said, what really got lost in translation was the heart. No parents to add depth to the plights of their sons and daughters, and no connecting points that weren't immediately undone by whatever moronic thing Mike pulled out of his ass this week. Instead, we get boring stand-ins of better characters created from 2, maybe 3 randomly picked shallow details and forcibly instilled lifeless acting. The only time they really broke away from that trend was revising Decker and Dayu. It was a great change to make, and as I mentioned, I do think it actually improves both characters. But when you have the roster the Shinkenger sport, you can't really replicate what worked by simply dubbing over them while either forgetting about or refusing to adapt what really, truly defined them. So while these two shows are a little bit closer in overall quality than most would like to admit, one has developed characters, one has more attention paid to the details, one has a satisfying payoff for the team in question, one has heart. The other? Well, they had John Sakor. And so concludes our extensive Shinkenger discussion. Next on the Toku docket shall be... you know what? Alien Rangers. I've put it off long enough, we're doing Alien Rangers. Let's finally talk about Alien Rangers. And until then, thanks for watching.